Welcome to Perspectives, and as always, we come to you from the studios of WCCA TV on Main Street in Worcester. Perspectives with Asima Silva, a wonderful guest today who is going to be joining us as we do so often now via Zoom and the way in which we're all relating to one another. As you can see, we are socially distanced. I have my mask for later on when I'm leaving, but we are ready to begin to talk to Dr. Celene Ibrahim. We're going to be talking about, she's an author, we're going to be talking about some of her books. And also, I know, just to begin with, we're going to be talking about Asima, her journey. She is somebody who is a convert to Islam, so we're going to be hearing that story from her as well.
Well, thank you for joining us again with Perspectives with Asima Silva. And today, as usual, we have a very interesting guest. It's a guest that I've been trying to have for 9 months to a year, but as stars have aligned, we finally have gotten her on our schedule and her schedule. And she wrote a book called Gender of Women in Islam. And if you go to her website, which we'll share at the end, you will find more information about this book. But let's get started. Just as an introduction of how I met her because she was a chaplain, a Muslim chaplain at Tufts University. And for many years, I've been very interested in some of the classes that she has taught and the lectures and speeches that I've attended that she has conducted. And today, she's going to talk more about her book, but more interestingly, about how she also found her path to Islam. So thank you so much. And finally, we have you on the show, and you were able to squeeze us in your busy schedule. And as Hank said, because of COVID, unfortunately, you couldn't be here in person, and we have you on Zoom. And hopefully our connection is clear, and we're going to have a great conversation. So if you want, please get us started and just give us an introduction to yourself and maybe a hint about your journey to Islam.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I have come to Islam 15 years ago now. And for me, I've always been a student of world religions since I was a teenager, really. And I'm still a student of world religions, although I'm a teacher now in an independent school located not too far from Boston called Groton School. And at Groton School, I get to teach philosophy and courses on racial justice and women's studies and my bread and butter Islamic studies, as well as courses in the world's religions.
So I'm going to give the floor to Hank first, before I ask my question.
Thank you, because I do think that's interesting, just the timing of 15 years ago. There was, well, not as if there isn't today, but there would have been so much turmoil at the time. What was the reaction? And I understand that even from just your description now, you're probably surrounded or meeting with some people who are fairly progressive, but it was a time in America when I would think that somebody coming out and saying, hey, I'm converting to Islam, would have been met by a few people who said, really?
I've been met by people who said that and more. So my initial impetus into studying more about Islam came from a course that I took in the context of my own education. Incidentally, it was also at an independent boarding school where I was exposed to a lot of different world religious traditions, and not merely exposed in a textbook way, but it was an international school, and I had many friends of all different faiths. And I distinctly remember being introduced to the Muslim prayer by a young woman from Senegal. And to me, it was a horizon opening moment, because in my previous upbringing, up until I began to get more exposure to the world's religions, prayer for me was something you did in your mind. Maybe you stood, maybe you kneeled, but it was a mental activity of sorts. And the first time I witnessed Muslim prayer, I was very much enchanted by this movement of my friends at that time in unison, but yet each of them kind of whispering and having their own private moment. So for me, I was intrigued by this sense of unity in an individualism, and also in a very embodied way. And in Muslim prayer, there's a position where your forehead is on the ground. And that to me was a revolution in sort of what it meant to be humble in a state of prayer, because it was literally a humbling posture.
Yeah, as you came to this, and as you came to Islam, and now to be writing about it and teaching about it, what was it that made you want to share with others? And as I've looked at, I will admit that I have not yet read, but as I have looked at some of the books and know a little bit about what you are working on right now, you're very interested in the way in which it seems to fit in with others, and particularly with women's place in the religion of Islam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I consider myself a student of all religions, really. I have a personal practice that's grounded in Islam. My belief system, my way of viewing the world is very much grounded in an Islamic way of thought. But I think that there's so much that we can learn across religious boundaries. I think there's a lot of posturing to want to say, I have all the answers from my tradition, from my spiritual path. But to me, that's a form of arrogance, to think that one spiritual tradition can have all the answers to this complicated affair that is human life. So for me, while I'm grounded in a particular practice, I'm always kind of have my antennae up to incorporate and understand the world from different perspectives, to help that deepen my own relationship with other human beings, my own sense of connection to this planet, to the causes that I personally care about. And on the point about women, I came of age in an era where I received a lot of messages about girl power. But then I also became a wife and a mother and a young professional in a world in which girl power sometimes exists and sometimes it really doesn't. And so I had to sort for myself, as I imagine many young women have to do, where was my power? Where was my authentic femininity, if you will? How did I want to wear that, express that? How did I want my spiritual life, my religious life, to reflect this aspect of my being? And about that same time, I also had the opportunity to encounter in a really deep and profound way feminist thought and the legacy of feminist thought, at least from a Western standpoint. And so both my own process of self-discovery as a young woman and this really powerful intellectual genealogy that has said women have often gotten the shorter stick in all kinds of social arrangements, all kinds of legal systems, all kinds of familial situations. Those two coming together was particularly powerful. And at that time, when I converted into Islam, there were many discourses very disparaging of Muslim women. And I was trying to undo a lot of those in my immediate circles. And it turns out that became a bit of a passion.
Well, I was just going to say, of course, Asima, clearly a lot of my introduction to Islam is through you. So, strong woman. Whereas at the time, a lot of what I was hearing in the media, and particularly on social media, was, oh, look, did you see at this particular convention, Islamic women aren't allowed to speak. The men do all the talking. And then you came on the show, and I said, well, I don't know, that sort of challenges that conception. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say that, and part of the reason why I was really interested in bringing Celene on our show is part of what you said is a similar journey that I took. Even though I was born and raised as a Muslim, I was very curious on why people always clung to one religion or another. Growing up as a minority in an environment, it was a majority white Christian Jewish neighborhood. Wondering why people wanted to cling to one Abrahamic religion versus another Abrahamic religion. And obviously, because my family is of Indian ethnicity, the other Asian religions were also in the back of my head, very curious about, well, there's so many other people from all these other different religions. And I too, being a young adult, decided I wanted to go investigate other religions. And in my opinion, and I'm going to ask you this question, but in my opinion, I feel that there is a form of spirituality, a academic exercise, and maybe an experiential reality that have to all come together for a person to really choose one religion versus another religion. And for me, when I did this kind of investigation of different faiths, I went through more of an academic exercise. And the reason why I wanted to really have you on, and I'm going to ask you two questions, is one, how did you come to this religion? What part of your experiential, spiritual, and even academic did this bring to you to come to Islam from where you were? And the second part of the question is, for me, I believe that, when we accept, I accepted this to be a Muslim. I actually went as an overt exercise and said, okay, now that I've studied all these religions, where would I align myself? What would I want to call myself? And one of the major reasons I actually chose Islam, even though I was raised Muslim, was because of the women gender rights in Islam, and which is the book you wrote about. So if you could also cover what are the major themes that you wrote about, especially what Hank just said. There's so much miscommunication and misinterpretation and this stereotype of women in Islam. And I'm really curious about what viewpoint you took and what your goal and motivation was with this book.
Yes. At the time when I really started to become serious about my own commitment to Islamic spiritual practice, I was living in an all-women's dorm in Cairo. And that experience showed me so many women who were wise beyond their years. I was in my early 20s and I certainly didn't feel wise, but I was surrounded by people who had a wisdom grounded in empathy and just a lovely way of holding themselves. And so if I were to put a finger on my personal foray into this space, granted, I was studying Arabic at the time. I was studying Quran at the time. I had a background by then in all different world religious traditions, both academic and experiential. But I guess it was that community of women and some of the relationships that I formed there that made me think more, I might say, more personally about where I was in my own character development versus maybe where I could be, even as a young person. And I think to get to the woman piece a little bit, there's our traditions, Islam, any other world religion, philosophical tradition, you can always pull out different threads. And people do that, and they try to define a religion by one or two narrow threads potentially. And so there's a way to read Islamic discourses where you come up with a picture that is in fact very oppressive, repressive, and we might say demeaning towards women. That's possible. Those sources are out there. I've seen them, I've written on them. But for my own enterprise of coming to Islam in a way that felt coherent and as true as possible as I could be to trying to understand the message of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, in his time, and a message that transcends his time, I found a very woman-affirming message. And not just a woman-affirming message, but a message affirming racial differences as part of a beautiful cosmic order that was divinely ordained, a system of the human being interacting with the natural world in a way that emphasized balance and justice. And so what I found, and more, and what I found in terms of an Islamic perspective on women was that it was very balanced and in harmony. And and that harmony extended into multiple other spheres. So Salam, the root from which Islam is derived, a lot of people know that it means peace, but it also means wholeness. And so to have a wholeness, it implies a sense of balance and a sense of harmony. And that's what I find when I look at the authentic sources of Islam, when I look at the Quran, when I look at the depictions of the way in which the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, treated not just the women members of the community, but the poor members of his community, the elderly members of his community, and so forth. So I've found that balance, and it's something that I've tried to articulate and teach and hold within my own practice.
Since both of you have looked at other religions, I am kind of curious, are there places where everyone agrees, and then how do things diverge? And is the treatment of women one of the places where religions tend to begin to diverge into different thought?
Yes, I think this idea of renunciating the selfish aspects that seem to be inherent in human nature is a thread that you find through multiple religious traditions. And whether it's through emphasizing a constantly changing and transforming self, or whether it's through emphasizing an ego self, and nafs, as we say in Arabic, that can be a little self-destructive in terms of its desires for worldly, not, an excess of worldly consumption, or its desires for praise, or its desires for, to be, to feel a sense of self-gratification. And so that concept of some part of human nature that can get a bit out of control if not held in check by religious teachings or philosophical teachings that emphasize the interdependence of human beings, the interdependence of the natural world, the fundamental state of weakness of the human being. And those are some of the common themes that I'm finding in multiple traditions. Also, just the sense that a human life, goes through stages that need commemorating in some form. And you find that this is, whether you're talking about world religions or whether you're talking about indigenous traditions, you're going to find birth rituals, you're going to find coming of age rituals, you're going to find rituals around partnership and procreation, you're going to find rituals around death and dying, you're going to find ways for people to correct previous, erroneous behavior. So I think in that sense, you can really look maybe from a more anthropological view and say, there must be something intrinsic in our nature that needs moments to commemorate, memorialize, gather together to honor or recognize.
I'm just thinking that perhaps some of our world leaders might want to spend a little time in humble reflection as I'm listening to this. Maybe that would be good for us. What are you working on now? I know that you're actually in the midst of writing a new book.
Yes, I am. And this book, it's coming out from Cambridge University Press, and it's on the concept of Tawheed, or monotheism, is a slightly insufficient way, but a possible way to translate it. And what I'm looking at in that book is not only the intellectual concept of monotheism, but how does this concept inform spiritual practice at different levels? So it's a book that sort of cuts right to the center of what it means to be Muslim, both in a sense of what you pronounce as your creed and in a sense of what you do, how you carry yourself in the world.
Awesome. At the same time that we're having this conversation, doesn't it seem? I know that I've been hearing about this since I was a kid, and I don't know. Maybe my dad heard the same thing when he was a boy. But it seems as if here we are talking about religion and how much it means, and the work that you are doing. At the same time, that it seems as so many people in the world are moving away from any kind of. Well, I don't know. Are they moving away from organized religion, or they're moving away from religion altogether? And it is really more about, geez, just how much money can I make and what's in my 401k?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Hank, because I'm not sure if it's just about moving away, but it's also disbelieving. It's not just removing themselves from the religion, but it's also disbelieving, or this group that is becoming more spiritual rather than a ritualistic type of following of a religion. But I would love your input on that question.
In some ways, I think it's very wise to move away from organized religion, because what we've seen many times from organized religion is a certain level of corruption that is not reflective of the values that were originally articulated by the great teachers of that religion. And you see that across the board. So it's not to point fingers, but just to say this is a tendency that religion is one of those ways in which people can manipulate social systems, manipulate an individual's psyche to have power over that individual. And so it's perfectly understandable why people would want to move away in some respects from organized religion. What I don't see people moving away from is the need for connection, the need for ways to overcome grief in moments of loss, the need to understand the frailty of the human condition, the need to be in physical relationships, embodied, having a sense of embodied intimacy with one another. And what part of what religion, to use this vast term that is in many respects inadequate to capture what it's trying to point at, it's offering ways to be human in community. And that is something I don't think human beings will ever move away from. I think we're wired to want meaningful relationships, to want lives of purpose, to need really perspectives that are beyond the extent of our own day-to-day needs and desires.
Yeah, I mean, I think the perspectives that we have, right, and bringing that in. That's what we're trying to do here. I am curious, just sort of about your day to day. So you're interacting, it seems like, with a lot of people, but with a lot of young people in particular.
Yes, they're wonderful. I have students from 14 to 18, and we're talking about philosophy and existential questions, and looking at what is climate justice, what is racial justice. So it's a hopeful space to be in a world that is literally on fire. And so, I young people, they say that all the time, do give me a lot of hope. I'm working with a lot of really bright young people who have a lot of passion. But I'm also working with a very privileged set of young people who get to be in a very insular boarding school environment that is not, an education that is not possible for the vast majority of young people. So my impact, it's something I personally wrestle with regularly, that I'm educating already a very elite segment, a very socioeconomically, for the most part, privileged the student body. And I would love, to be able to have a wider impact, even as I know I'm having a deep impact on the individuals that I do get a chance to be with.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, it must be. I'm sure that it is very interesting. So, on the one hand, as you're talking about social justice issues and the way in which these young people are dealing with them, are they wrestling with the fact that they come from privilege? I would like to wrestle with the fact that I come from privilege, but I mean, are they? I don't know. Is that something that they struggle with a little bit? Is there a way in which that can actually help? As you have pointed out, there are probably our next generation of leaders.
I think there's a way to go through privileged independent schools in this country and in other places where you do not ever have to wrestle with questions of privilege or with social justice issues beyond recycling or not recycling, like substantive, really heavy issues of privilege and access. But I think our school has a faculty who is very committed. A majority of them are very committed to making this a part of every classroom. And so we're having conversations around how do you encourage students in STEM classes to think about issues of privilege and social responsibility. How do you, obviously it's a topic that lends itself naturally to religion and philosophy. But I think that these conversations don't necessarily happen without a body of like a teaching staff that is, number one, having these conversations among themselves, and number two, very conscientiously bringing these conversations in the classroom in ways that it doesn't alienate students that come from immense privilege or that might be on 100% scholarship. And so we have to be very attentive, I think, as educators to addressing the meta issues, while we're speaking to human beings that represent the different demographics, that we're talking about at the meta level. It's not easy. And, when it works, it's elating when you can really have deep, substantive conversations. But sometimes, it's possible. Sometimes you leave the classroom feeling like that conversation didn't go well, or that was so awkward, or it's not always an easy thing. It's not magic.
Well, that's probably a good thing. That sometimes it's not. They're not supposed to be easy conversations. Asima, I see by the clock on the wall that we are starting to run out of time.
So thank you so much for joining us, Celene. But I'm going to just start, finish with one comment. But I'm going to give you 10 seconds to maybe say, how would you summarize your book, The Gender and Women in Islam? If you had to summarize it in one sentence, what would you say?
Mm-hmm. It's about looking at the stories of women in the Quran and understanding how their lives can apply to issues in our present.
Thank you so much for joining us. And that is our show for Perspectives with Asima Silva. But before I finish, I just wanted to share with you my view of if I had someone ask me, why did you choose Islam? And I had mentioned part of was the women's rights. And I'm going to repeat what I really felt when I was a teenager choosing between religions. And I think in this day and age, and even back then, when I say these particular situation, I'm going to ask you to think about, have we achieved this type of women power even in the 21st century, the day that we live in today? So the reason why I just couldn't walk away from this religion was one of the major powerful women images in Islam is Khadija radiallahu anha, who was the first wife of the Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what she was a divorced woman with children, owned her own company. She actually proposed to him, was older than him, and she's the one who helped give him the confidence to send out his message. So till this day, I ask myself, have we achieved that kind of woman power that Islam has portrayed as a strong woman in Islam? So for that reason, it's one of the reasons why I had chosen this religion to answer your question, Hank. So thank you so much, Celene, and I look forward to looking at reading your book and actually spreading the word. And we will be sharing with you the link that you can go on, CeleneIbrahim.org, and I hope you will join us again on next week's episode.